The road that looked empty. At 3:42 in the morning, on a frozen road west of Rzeszów, a German tank commander lifted himself just high enough above the hatch to see the road ahead. There was almost nothing to see. A strip of snow, a dark wall of pine trees, the pale edge of a ditch where the wind had carved the powder into hard little ridges. The engine beneath him kept turning with a tired metallic pulse, uneven in the cold. Somewhere behind, a truck coughed twice and then steadied. The column had been ordered to move before daylight, while the forest was still black and the Soviet guns were supposed to be blind. He looked through his field glasses. No muzzle flash, no movement, no figures running between the trees, only silence. And that was the first mistake. Less than 30 meters from the road, a Soviet sapper lay half-buried beneath branches and snow. He had stopped feeling 2 fingers on his left hand. His sleeve was stiff where melted frost had refrozen against the cloth. In front of him, almost invisible under the snow, a thin wire ran from his glove toward the road. It did not look like a weapon. It looked like something forgotten, a line, a thread. But the wire ended beside a charge placed where the second German vehicle would pass. Not the first. The first vehicle was allowed to move through the killing ground. That was the discipline of the ambush. The first vehicle gave confidence to the rest. It told the driver behind that the road was safe. It pulled the column forward, one engine after another, until the Germans were no longer approaching the trap. They were inside it. The sapper did not think of doctrine. He did not think of history. He thought of the order whispered to him before dawn. Wait. Let them come close. Let them believe the road is empty. Let them hear nothing until it is too late to turn. For the men in the German column, the war still had shape. There was a road. There was a destination. There were maps folded under leather gloves. There were reports that described enemy resistance in measured phrases. Scattered fire, local counterattack, temporary obstruction, anti-tank defense. The reports made it sound manageable. The road did not. The commander lowered his binoculars. The second vehicle entered the narrowest part of the track. Its left side dipped slightly into a rut. Snow slid down from the branches above. The sapper's thumb tightened. For one more second, nothing happened. Then the road opened. The blast came from underneath and to the side, not like artillery falling from a distance, but like the earth itself striking upward. Metal tore. A wheel lifted. Someone shouted. The engine noise became a scream of steel, steam, and men trying to understand what had already happened. Before the column could stop cleanly, rifle fire snapped from the trees. A machine gun opened from a place the commander had already looked at and dismissed as empty. Farther back, another explosion struck the rear of the line. The column was not destroyed. That was not the point. It was trapped, confused, blinded by smoke and snow, with every man suddenly aware of the same impossible truth. The enemy was not ahead of them. The enemy was beside them. German reports would later describe moments like this with controlled language. They had to. Armies write reports to create order from events that had none. They speak of resistance, losses, enemy activity, terrain, and tactical adjustments. They do not easily record the way a man hesitates before entering another forest road. They do not always admit how quickly confidence can shrink when the first shot comes from 10 meters away. But the fear was there. It lived in the pauses before villages, in the extra artillery fired into empty-looking tree lines, in the way infantry moved more slowly beside tanks, in the way drivers stared at ditches, in the way German soldiers learned that, on the Eastern Front, silence was rarely empty. The Germans had believed distance would protect them. Distance gave a tank time to aim. Distance gave artillery time to respond. Distance gave officers time to think, radios time to speak, formations time to maneuver. But Soviet close-range ambushes attacked distance itself. And once distance disappeared, so did many of the things the German army trusted most. The wire in the sapper's hand was not just a detonator line. It was a boundary. On one side of it was the German belief in movement, control, and superior tactical method. On the other side was the battlefield as Soviet soldiers had learned to fight it. Close, patient, dirty, and terrifyingly personal. The tank commander did not know that yet. He only knew that the road, a moment ago so quiet, had become too narrow to escape, and somewhere in the smoke, men he could not see were still waiting to fire again. The German faith in distance. The German army did not enter the Soviet Union thinking of itself as careless. Its confidence had reasons. In Poland, in France, across the early campaigns of the war, German officers had seen speed and coordination break armies that looked strong on paper. Tanks moved with infantry. Artillery shifted quickly. Radios carried orders through noise and dust. Commanders were expected to act before permission arrived from above. The machine worked because it did not wait for the battlefield to become clear. It forced clarity onto the battlefield. To many German officers, that was modern war. Movement, fire, initiative, shock. A tank seen at 1,000 meters could be engaged. A village identified on a map could be shelled. A defensive line could be outflanked. A retreating enemy could be pursued before he recovered his balance. Distance in that system was not emptiness. It was a kind of protection. It gave time for the gunner to find the target. Time for the commander to speak into the radio. Time for the artillery observer to correct fire. Time for training to do what training was supposed to do. The early German view of Soviet troops often carried a dangerous mixture of respect and contempt. Many German soldiers understood quickly that the Red Army soldier could endure punishment few Western armies had faced. They saw men fight from surrounded positions, hold ruins after bombardment, and counterattack when logic said they should have broken. But at the same time, German assessments often treated Soviet attacks as crude, wasteful, badly coordinated, or dependent on numbers rather than method. That belief was comforting. It allowed a German officer to explain Soviet resistance without fully respecting Soviet adaptation. If a Soviet unit appeared suddenly at close range, it could be called infiltration. If a tank was lost on a forest track, it could be blamed on poor reconnaissance. If a column was struck from the ditch, it could be written as an ambush, a local event, something unfortunate but contained. What was harder to admit was that Soviet forces were learning how to make German strengths less useful. A German tank was dangerous when it could see. It was less dangerous when it was buttoned up, moving through smoke, watching windows, ditches, haystacks, and tree lines all at once. German artillery was devastating when the target could be located. It was less useful when the enemy was almost touching the forward troops. German command was powerful when information moved. It struggled when the first minutes of combat produced only static, shouts, and contradictory reports from men who could not tell where the fire was coming from. The Germans believed they were bringing order eastward. The East refused to remain ordered. Roads vanished into mud. Forests swallowed flanks. Villages appeared empty until a cellar fired. Ravines cut across maps that had not shown them clearly. Snow softened the shape of the ground until every ditch looked harmless. In summer, dust hid movement. In autumn, rain turned tracks into traps. In winter, sound carried strangely across frozen fields, making engines seem closer or farther than they were. And in all of it, Soviet soldiers watched. They watched how German tanks entered villages. They watched how infantry spread out near roads. They watched where officers stood when columns halted. They watched which vehicles carried fuel, which carried ammunition, which ones had antennas, which ones had bridging equipment. They learned that they did not always need to defeat the German army in a clean fight. They needed to break the rhythm. A column that stopped was vulnerable. A tank separated from infantry was vulnerable. A commander forced to look backward was vulnerable. A road blocked at the wrong point could turn a battalion into a line of targets. A few minutes of confusion could matter more than an hour of fire. German doctrine had answers for ambush. No serious army ignores such dangers. There were drills, screens, reconnaissance patrols, artillery precautions, infantry support, engineers, and standard responses. But doctrine is written in language that assumes men can recognize what is happening quickly enough to act on it. Close-range ambushes stole that first understanding. They made the opening seconds belong to the defender. A Soviet rifleman behind a log, a sapper in a ditch, a machine gun crew in a barn, an anti-tank rifle team hidden near a road. These were not impressive in the way a tank formation was impressive. They did not photograph well from the air. They did not dominate maps. They did not look like the center of a campaign. But they could make a German unit feel, suddenly and violently, that the battlefield had been misread. That feeling mattered. Fear does not always appear as panic. Sometimes it appears as caution. A delay. A request for more artillery. Patrol sent twice. A tank halted at the edge of a village because the commander does not like the windows. An infantryman staring too long at a pile of snow beside the road. German reports could count destroyed vehicles and enemy dead. They could mark positions and describe terrain. But what they could not easily measure was the slow education of fear, the way repeated close-range attacks taught men that any quiet place might already be occupied by someone patient enough to wait. The Germans had built a way of war around movement. The Soviets began to ask a different question. What if movement itself could be made dangerous? The hidden battlefield inside the battlefield. On a map, a road is a line. On the Eastern Front, it could be a trap. That difference killed men. A German staff officer might look at a route and see a connection between 2 points. A village, a bridge, a crossroads, a supply area. He might mark the route in pencil, estimate the distance, assign a unit, and calculate when the column should arrive. The road had a purpose. It allowed movement, carried the war forward. But the men waiting beside that road saw something else. They saw where the trees pressed closest to the track. They saw the bend where a driver would slow. They saw the ditch deep enough to hide 2 men and an anti-tank rifle. They saw the small bridge where vehicles would bunch together. They saw the place where the snow drifted naturally over disturbed earth. They saw where a German commander, trying to keep momentum, would be tempted to trust what appeared empty. The battlefield had 2 versions. There was the visible battlefield, the one drawn by headquarters. Unit boundaries, objectives, arrows, roads, rivers, towns. And there was the hidden battlefield, the one built by men on their stomachs in mud. Soviet close-range ambushes lived in that second battlefield. They were shaped by terrain more than by romance. A forest was not just cover. It was a wall that shortened sight lines. A village was not just a cluster of houses. It was a maze of windows, cellars, fences, barns, wells, and collapsed roofs. A ravine was not just a depression in the ground. It was a concealed approach route. A swamp track was not just difficult going. It was a place where vehicles had no room to maneuver. A ruined city block was not simply destruction. It was elevation, concealment, firing holes, rubble, and sudden death at the length of a room. Soviet soldiers did not need ideal conditions. They needed enough. Enough darkness to move. Enough branches to hide a gun. Enough smoke to shift position. Enough rubble to let a grenade team crawl close. Enough snow to cover disturbed soil. Enough fear in the approaching enemy to slow him for half a minute. That half minute could be everything. German armor had power, but it was not magic. A tank crew saw the world through narrow openings, periscopes, optics, and the commander's exposed glance. When buttoned up, the crew became safer and blinder at the same time. The engine was loud. The inside smelled of oil, metal, sweat, and propellant. Orders could be misunderstood. A driver could not see what the commander saw. The gunner could not engage what had not been identified. A turret could only turn so fast. A shell could only be loaded after the last one was fired. Close-range ambush compressed all of that. It gave the tank crew too many threats in too little space. A shot from the flank. A mine under the track. A grenade from a cellar. A machine gun striking the infantry support. Smoke drifting across the road. Someone shouting that the enemy is behind them. Someone else shouting that the enemy is in front. A radio operator asking for a report no one can give. This was not chaos by accident. At its best, it was arranged chaos. The Soviet goal was often not to stand in the open and trade fire. It was to force German units into a bad geometry. Too narrow, too close, too confused, too late. German advantages remained real, but they could be made to arrive after the decisive seconds had already passed. A hidden anti-tank gun did not need to survive the afternoon if it disabled the right vehicle in the first minute. A sapper did not need to stop the entire column if he blocked the road where no one could pass. A machine gun team did not need to defeat every German soldier if it pinned the infantry long enough for the tanks to move without protection. A partisan mine did not need to win a battle if it delayed supplies that were expected somewhere else before nightfall. The reports often separated these things. Mine incident, ambush, infantry resistance, road obstruction, local enemy activity. But the battlefield did not separate them. To the men inside the column, it came as one event. The road exploded, the trees fired, the infantry went down, the radio filled with static, and the way forward disappeared. There was also a moral difficulty in admitting the effectiveness of such fighting. German military culture valued discipline, skill, and command presence. To be stopped by a clear enemy line was one thing. To be halted by men hidden in ditches, cellars, and forests was something else. It felt less like being beaten in a contest of arms and more like being hunted. And hunting changes the hunted. It makes him look at the ground differently. It makes him hear small sounds. A branch cracking. Snow falling from a roof. A dog not barking in a village that should have dogs. A cart left in the road at just the wrong angle. A dead horse lying where vehicles must slow. A house with no smoke from the chimney, though someone has cleared a path to the door. The German soldier learned to read these signs because not reading them could mean dying before he ever saw the man who killed him. What the Germans believed was that the battlefield could be controlled through speed, discipline, and superior coordination. What really happened was that Soviet soldiers learned to create a second battlefield beneath the first, one that did not appear clearly on German maps until blood had already marked it. And the men who built that hidden battlefield were often the men headquarters noticed least. The men waiting close enough to hear. They were not always elite troops. That matters. The Soviet men who carried out close-range ambushes were often tired infantrymen, sappers, scouts, anti-tank riflemen, machine gunners, local partisans, junior officers, and boys who had learned the front by surviving it for one more week. Some had training. Some had only experience. Some had both, and those were the most dangerous. They were cold. They were hungry. Their equipment was often rough, heavy, or worn. Their boots might be soaked through. Their weapons might be caked with mud. Their orders might be simple enough to fit into a whisper. Wait until the second vehicle. Fire at the flank. Throw only when you can hit. Do not reveal yourself early. There is a kind of courage in attack that armies understand easily. Men rise, shout, advance, and history knows what to call it. The courage of an ambush is quieter. It is the courage to remain still while danger comes closer. A Soviet anti-tank rifleman with a PTRD or PTRS had no illusion that his weapon made him invincible. The rifle was long, heavy, violent to fire, and increasingly limited against heavier German armor as the war developed. But at close range, against lighter vehicles, side plates, tracks, vision devices, engine compartments, or support vehicles, it could still shape a fight. More than that, it could make German armor uncomfortable. It could remind a crew that steel had weak places. The rifleman had to choose the moment. Too early, and the flash would reveal him. Too late, and the tank might already be past, or the machine gun might find him first. He would lie behind snow, brush, a fence line, a broken wall. His cheek would press against cold metal. His breathing would become too loud in his own ears. The tank would grow larger. That was the hardest part. Not firing. A sapper's work was different but no less intimate. He dealt in wires, charges, mines, pressure, timing, and touch. At night, he might crawl toward a road while artillery moved somewhere far off like weather. He had to know the soil by feel. Frozen ground resisted him. Mud swallowed tools. Snow betrayed movement if handled badly. A mine placed carelessly could be found. A wire laid poorly could break. A charge set in the wrong place could waste the entire ambush. He worked with small things while large things hunted him. The German army had tanks, guns, trucks, radios, maps, and formations. The sapper had fingers he could barely feel and a few minutes before dawn. A machine gun crew in a village had another problem. They needed concealment, but they also needed a field of fire. A window was obvious. A doorway could be watched. A cellar hole might limit vision. A barn loft gave height but trapped the crew if the building burned. Every position was a bargain with death. The junior officer or sergeant leading such a group had to make decisions no map could solve. Where to place the first weapon. Where to let the enemy enter. Who fires first. Who holds fire. Where the men fall back if the Germans recover quickly. How long to stay before artillery comes down. Whether to rescue the wounded or leave them because the entire group will die if they wait. These were not grand decisions. They were small and terrible. German reports rarely had room for them. A line might say that Soviet infantry opened fire from concealed positions. Another might mention mines and anti-tank weapons. But those phrases flatten the human shape of the event. They do not show a man biting his glove to keep his teeth from chattering. They do not show a sapper listening for the difference between the first engine and the second. They do not show a machine gunner lowering his head because plaster is falling from the ceiling with each German shell. The Soviets did not invent ambush. Every army understands surprise. But on the Eastern Front, Soviet soldiers refined the use of closeness because the conditions demanded it. Against German mobility, they used terrain. Against German optics, they used concealment. Against German command tempo, they used suddenness. Against fear, they used discipline. Not always perfect, not always enough, but often enough to make the Germans pay for every assumption. And there was something else. A Soviet soldier defending his own land did not always need to be told why the village mattered. He might know the road. He might know the bend. He might know where the ditch deepened because he had walked it before the war. A partisan might know which bridge froze badly in winter, which patch of forest stayed dry after rain, which German patrol always returned at the same hour. Local knowledge could become military knowledge. The Germans believed these men were fragments of resistance. What really happened was that fragments could cut. A handful of riflemen, a hidden gun, 2 sappers, a machine gun, a few mines. None of it looked decisive by itself. But war is not always moved by what looks decisive. Sometimes it turns on whether a driver stops, whether infantry dismount too late, whether a commander hesitates, whether one vehicle burns in a road too narrow to pass. And for that, the Soviets did not need a perfect weapon. They needed men willing to let the Germans come close. The next question was the cruelest one. How close was close enough? Let the tank come closer. The order sounds wrong until the battlefield explains it. Let the tank come closer. For a soldier in a ditch, this was almost an insult to instinct. Every nerve in the body wanted distance. Distance meant a chance to run. Distance meant the enemy was still part of the landscape, still a shape moving toward you, not yet a machine filling the world with noise and weight. But distance also helped the tank. At longer range, a German crew had more time to see muzzle flashes, identify likely positions, call targets, turn the turret, bring machine guns to bear, or order infantry forward. The tank could use its gun as a blunt instrument. A barn could be hit. A tree line could be swept. A suspicious wall could be smashed. If the ambush revealed itself too early, German firepower could become organized before the trap had done its work. So the Soviet team waited. Not because waiting was safe, because waiting made the enemy less safe. Close range changed the value of almost everything. A grenade that was useless at 50 meters became deadly at 15. An anti-tank rifle with limited effect against frontal armor could matter if aimed at a side, track, vision slit, or lighter vehicle. A mine that disabled one vehicle at the wrong point could halt everything behind it. A machine gun that could not destroy a tank could cut away the infantry meant to protect it. German armor was not just steel. It was a system. Tanks needed infantry to clear close threats. They needed engineers to handle mines. They needed fuel vehicles, ammunition trucks, recovery equipment, radio contact, road space, and commanders who understood what was happening. Close-range ambushes attacked the system. The target was often not the strongest tank. It was the connection between things. The second vehicle. The last vehicle. The radio vehicle. The truck with men still seated under canvas. The motorcycle messenger. The engineer half-track. The fuel truck whose destruction would make the road burn hot enough to stop thought itself. This is why the first vehicle might be allowed to pass. To the men inside it, that felt like luck. To the ambush team, it was bait. There was a psychology to it. If the lead vehicle passed safely, the column relaxed by a degree. Drivers followed the track. Spacing closed. Men stopped scanning the ditch with the same intensity. The danger seemed to have been tested and disproven. Then the charge struck the second or third vehicle, and the road behind filled with braking engines and shouting. A German commander had to make decisions at once. Push forward? Reverse? Dismount infantry? Call artillery? Fire into both sides of the road? Evacuate wounded? Protect the rear? Find the enemy? Report the position? The ambush had already answered its own question. It did not need to destroy every German. It needed to make too many things happen at the same time. For the Soviet soldiers, this was also the point of maximum danger. The first shots revealed positions. Once revealed, they were vulnerable to everything the German army did well. Machine guns, high explosive, mortars, tank fire, flamethrowers in some settings, infantry assault. The ambush team might have seconds to fire, throw, detonate, and withdraw if withdrawal was even possible. The phrase close-range ambush can sound technical. It was not technical to the man holding the grenade. He felt the ground shake. He smelled exhaust. He saw black crosses pass between branches or through gaps in a wall. He knew that if he rose too soon, he would be cut down. He knew that if he rose too late, the moment would pass and the tank would crush the position or expose his comrades. There was no heroic music in that decision. Only timing. Some men failed. Some fired early. Some froze. Some threw badly. Some were killed before they could move. Some positions were discovered by German scouts. Some ambushes were broken by artillery before they began. War was not a perfect lesson repeated cleanly from one side to the other. But enough ambushes worked to teach a pattern. The Germans began to learn that Soviet defenders did not always fire when first seen because they had not seen the Germans. Sometimes they had seen them clearly and were waiting for a better second. That realization is a special kind of fear. It means the enemy's silence has intention. A quiet village is not empty. A forest edge is not passive. A snowbank is not only snow. The absence of fire does not mean safety. It may mean the enemy wants you closer. German reports could describe the result. A tank disabled. Casualties from close-range fire. Resistance from concealed positions. Mines encountered. Advance delayed. But they rarely captured the private horror of understanding that the enemy had looked at you, measured you, and chosen not to fire yet. That was the hidden power of the tactic. It turned German confidence against itself. And when the first shot finally came, the most important part of the battle had already happened. The Germans had entered the distance the Soviets wanted. The first 10 seconds. The first 10 seconds of an ambush do not feel like 10 seconds. They feel broken. There is the moment before when the road still belongs to engines and orders. Then there is the blast or the gunshot or the sudden hard crack of a machine gun. After that, time stops behaving properly. Some men remember every detail. Others remember only smoke. A German column enters a village road at low speed. The houses on both sides are damaged but not destroyed. A cart lies near a fence. A roof beam has fallen into the street. The lead vehicle moves around it, slowly. No one likes the obstruction, but it is not unusual. Everything in Russia seems broken, abandoned, or half buried in mud. The first vehicle passes. The second begins the same turn. Then the mine goes. The sound is not only loud. It is physical. Men feel it in their ribs. Snow and dirt slap against metal. A track snaps or a wheel folds inward. The vehicle lurches, blocking the narrowest part of the road. Before the men behind fully understand, a machine gun opens from a cellar window that had looked like a black square of emptiness. The first burst hits the infantry. Men dive for the ditch. Some fall into it. Others stay where they are because the body takes a moment to accept what the mind has heard. A German non-commissioned officer shouts for men to spread out. His voice disappears under the second burst. A Soviet anti-tank gun fires from behind a smashed wall less than 300 meters away. Maybe closer. The gun crew knows they will be seen now. They have chosen a position with enough concealment for the first shot, not enough protection for a duel. The shell strikes a vehicle in the middle of the column. Smoke rises. The road shrinks. A radio operator tries to report contact. He does not know where. Ahead? Left? Village? Forest? Mines? The question is not simple. The enemy has made it impossible to describe the battle in one direction. This is the true violence of a well-made ambush. It attacks language. It makes trained men speak in fragments. Fire from the left. No from the houses. Vehicle hit. Mines. Infantry down. Where is the gun? The tank commander turns his turret toward the most obvious muzzle flash. But the most obvious muzzle flash may be the bait. The machine gun draws the eye while a grenade team crawls closer from the side. German infantry must clear the houses, but they are pinned before they can organize. The tank can fire into the buildings, but each shot takes time, and every second another man is exposed. The rear of the column is struck next. This might be a second mine, a fallen tree pulled across the road, or fire from another hidden position. The effect is more important than the method. The Germans now have danger at both ends. Movement becomes a problem. Retreat is not clean. Advance is blocked. The sides of the road are not safe. Inside a tank, the world narrows. The crew hears impacts against armor. Some are harmless. Some are not. The commander must decide whether to stay exposed and see, or drop down and survive. If he stays up, he may be shot. If he closes the hatch, he loses the full picture. The driver waits for orders. The gunner sees only what the turret faces. The loader works by touch and habit. Sweat appears even in cold weather because fear heats the body in strange ways. Outside, the infantry suffer the worst of it. Tanks draw attention, but infantry bleed in the open. A man trying to run from one side of the road to the other may have no idea that a second Soviet position is waiting for exactly that movement. A medic may crawl toward a wounded soldier and then stop because the same beaten patch of snow is being fired on again and again. The Soviet side is not calm either. Their first shots have revealed them. The machine gun crew in the cellar knows the German tank will find them soon. The sapper who triggered the mine may have to crawl away while bullets cut branches above him. The anti-tank gun crew may get one more round loaded before the return fire comes. The grenade team may never reach the vehicle. The ambush is not a safe performance from invisibility. It is a knife fight that begins with surprise and then turns immediately into survival. But those first seconds belong to the men who waited. That is why the Germans feared them. Not always openly. Not always in the phrasing of reports. But in the body. In the tightening of the stomach before entering a village. In the glance toward a ditch. In the extra caution before a bend in the road. In the knowledge that by the time the ambush announces itself, the most important mistake has already been made. The German army trained to recover from shock. Many units did. They brought fire onto suspected positions. They pushed infantry forward. They used smoke, artillery, discipline, and experience. Some ambushes failed. Some Soviet teams were wiped out. Some German columns fought through with brutal efficiency. But the fear did not require every ambush to succeed. It required only enough of them to remind every man what might be waiting. A report written hours later could say the enemy opened fire from concealed positions and was driven off. The men who were there remembered it differently. They remembered the first 10 seconds. They remembered that the road had looked empty. What the report said and what the men felt. A military report has a job. It must make the battle readable. It takes smoke, noise, blood, error, courage, panic, and confusion, and turns them into sentences. It gives times, locations, unit names, losses, enemy strength, ammunition expenditure, terrain, and conclusions. Without reports, an army cannot learn. Without reports, chaos remains chaos. But reports also protect the men who write them. They make fear administrative. A German after-action account might describe Soviet fire from close range, concealed anti-tank weapons, mines on roads, or stubborn infantry resistance in woods and villages. The words are useful. They are not false. But they do not carry the full weight of the moment. Concealed fire does not smell like burning fuel. Enemy resistance does not show a driver trying to reverse with a dead vehicle behind him. Local counterattack does not capture the sound of men firing at windows because any one of them might hold the muzzle flash that killed their friend. Temporary delay does not explain what happens in a soldier's mind when he realizes the enemy was close enough to choose the moment of his fear. This gap between report and experience is not unique to the German army. It is part of war itself. Armies cannot write every tremor into official language. If they did, no report would ever end. But on the Eastern Front, that gap mattered because it hid one of the Red Army's growing strengths: its ability to make the Germans feel unsafe at close range. German officers had reasons to understate the psychological effect. To admit too much fear would complicate the image of German tactical superiority. It would suggest that Soviet infantry, often described in dismissive or racialized terms by Nazi ideology and German propaganda, had found ways to damage not only German vehicles but German confidence. It would mean acknowledging that the enemy was not merely enduring punishment, but studying how German units moved, reacted, and exposed themselves. There was also the problem of blame. If a unit was ambushed, who had failed? Reconnaissance? Infantry screening? Engineers? Command judgment? Map reading? Discipline? Or had the enemy simply done something well? Reports often prefer causes that can be corrected without unsettling the institution too deeply. More reconnaissance, better flank security, more artillery preparation, improved coordination, greater caution in forested areas. These were real lessons, but beneath them lay something harder to write. The Soviets were learning, and they were learning in ways that made German habits dangerous. The men at the front did not need the language of doctrine to understand this. They understood that a village could not be trusted because it was quiet. They understood that a road without shell holes might be more dangerous than one already torn apart. They understood that a dead horse, a broken cart, or a fallen tree might be an obstacle, or an invitation to slow down in the wrong place. They understood that if the lead vehicle passed safely, the danger had not necessarily passed with it. Fear became practical knowledge. It taught eyes to search the wrong-looking corner of a barn. It taught drivers to hate narrow bends. It taught infantrymen to keep closer to tanks, and tank commanders to resent any moment when infantry fell behind. It taught officers that an advance could lose its rhythm without losing many vehicles. It taught everyone that Soviet close-range attacks did not need to be large to be effective. They needed to be believed. Once a soldier believes an ambush may be waiting, the terrain changes. The same forest becomes thicker. The same road becomes narrower. The same ruin becomes occupied by possibility. Even if no shot comes, time has been lost. Nerves have been spent. Ammunition may be fired into empty positions. Men arrive tired from expecting death in every ditch. That is how fear becomes a weapon without being recorded as one. The official report might say the area was cleared by 9:20. It might not say what it cost the men to walk into it. And yet, German behavior changed. More caution before woods. More suspicion of villages. More emphasis on infantry screens. More shelling of likely ambush points. More respect, reluctant but real, for Soviet soldiers who could wait close enough to make German machines feel blind. The reports admitted the tactic. The men admitted the fear with their bodies. Pause before moving. A glance at the ditch. A hand tightening on a weapon. A commander asking for one more patrol before committing the column. These are not dramatic gestures. They are small. But war is full of small admissions. And by the time German units began changing the way they moved, the Soviet close-range ambush had already done more than destroy vehicles. It had entered German expectation. The fear of the tree line. The tree line became a kind of enemy, not always because it held Soviet soldiers, because it might. That was enough. A German unit approaching a forest edge on the Eastern Front was not looking at scenery. It was looking at a wall of uncertainty. Branches broke up shapes. Shadows made distance uncertain. Snow could hide tracks or preserve them too clearly. In summer, leaves concealed movement. In autumn, wet ground swallowed sound. In winter, a man in white could lie still and become part of the world until he moved. The Germans had tools for this. They were not fools walking blindly into every forest. Reconnaissance patrols moved ahead. Infantry screened armor. Artillery could rake the edge. Machine guns could fire into suspicious patches. Engineers could check roads. Commanders could dismount men and clear houses before vehicles entered. But every precaution cost time. And time was one of the currencies Germany could least afford to spend endlessly in the East. The German way of war, especially in its most successful early form, depended on tempo. Keep moving. Keep the enemy off balance. Exploit gaps. Do not allow the defender to recover. The longer a unit paused before a village, the more the enemy could reinforce, withdraw, prepare artillery, or strike somewhere else. The more often columns halted for suspected ambushes, the more the entire operational rhythm slowed. Soviet close-range tactics exploited that dilemma. Move quickly and risk the trap. Move cautiously and surrender time. Neither choice was clean. In forest fighting, the threat could come from positions too close for comfort. A machine gun might open from a shallow depression. Grenades could be thrown from behind logs or earthworks. Mines might sit on tracks where vehicles had no room to turn. Anti-tank rifles could fire from oblique angles and then disappear. Mortar fire might fall once the Germans bunched near a blockage. In villages, the danger became more intimate. A house could be cleared and then fired on from the next cellar. A tank could cover the street but not the room behind a wall. A German soldier entering a doorway might be fighting at arm's length before he had time to shout. Smoke from burning buildings made friend and enemy into silhouettes. A wounded man calling from the road might draw rescuers into a second field of fire. Ruins made the map dishonest. A street shown as open might be blocked by bricks, beams, and wreckage. A wall shown as a boundary might be full of holes. A building that looked destroyed from outside might have a cellar strong enough to hold a squad. At Stalingrad and in other urban battles, Soviet closeness became a deliberate answer to German firepower. The closer the lines, the harder it became for German artillery and aircraft to strike without endangering their own men. The Germans learned that the enemy did not always need distance to be dangerous. Sometimes he needed proximity. This changed how German soldiers felt about entering space. A field was not only a field. A gully was not only a gully. A haystack, a cart, a church wall, a drainage ditch, a pile of timber, each could be part of a pattern. The front was not a line. It was a series of questions. Who has seen us? Who is waiting? Why have they not fired? That last question was the worst, because silence, once understood as absence, became intention. German commanders could respond by using more firepower. Shell the tree line, burn the house, machine gun the ditch. But this too had limits. Ammunition was not infinite. Time was not infinite. Visibility was not reliable. And firing at every suspected position could exhaust men before the real fight began. Soviet ambush tactics did not have to win every engagement to have this effect. They only had to be credible. A mine found on one road made the next road suspicious. A tank lost in one village made the next village slower to enter. A machine gun in one cellar made every cellar a possible weapon. Fear became cumulative. It traveled with units. A veteran did not need to be told why the tree line mattered. He had seen what came out of one. Or worse, what did not come out until he was already too close. New men learned from old men's pauses. A commander's caution could be inherited by soldiers who had not witnessed the original ambush. This is why reports alone can mislead. A report records an event. Fear records a pattern. And by the middle years of the war, Soviet close-range ambushes had become part of the German pattern of expectation. The Germans still attacked. They still won fights. They still inflicted terrible casualties. But they no longer moved through the Eastern Front with the same easy contempt for hidden infantry. The tree line had taught them. The village had taught them. The road had taught them. And the lesson was simple. What looked empty might already be occupied by death. The mathematics of survival. War at close range is emotional. It is also mathematical. Not the clean mathematics of classrooms, but the hard arithmetic of seconds, meters, angles, and blocked roads. A tank does not need to be destroyed to stop a column. A road does not need to be cratered everywhere to become unusable. A gun crew does not need to survive long to change the outcome of a fight. A few men, placed correctly, can force a larger force to spend time it did not plan to spend. That was the mathematics Soviet ambush teams learned. Consider a narrow road through forest or village. If the lead vehicle is destroyed, the rest may halt. But if the first vehicle is allowed through and the second or third is hit, confusion multiplies. The front may still be moving, the rear may still be entering, and the middle is suddenly blocked. Orders travel poorly through smoke and engine noise. Vehicles cannot easily turn. Men dismount into fire. The column becomes less like a fist and more like a trapped animal, strong but unable to strike in one direction. A single disabled vehicle can become terrain. That is the first calculation. The second is reaction time. At several hundred meters, a tank crew may have time to identify a threat, turn the turret, load, aim, and fire. The infantry may have time to go to ground and locate muzzle flashes. A commander may understand the shape of the attack. At 50 meters, understanding arrives late. The grenade is already in the air. The mine has already detonated. The machine gun has already found the men in the truck. The anti-tank rifle has already fired and shifted position. Even if the German response is disciplined and effective, it is a response. The first decision belonged to the ambush. The third calculation is attention. A battlefield is not only a contest of weapons. It is a contest over what men look at. An explosion draws eyes. A visible machine gun draws fire. Smoke hides movement. A burning vehicle becomes both obstacle and distraction. A wounded soldier draws instinctive concern. An officer standing to restore order becomes a target. A good ambush divides attention faster than command can reunite it. This is why small weapons mattered more than their specifications might suggest. A grenade had a short range, but if the target was forced close enough, range stopped being a weakness. An anti-tank rifle could be limited against heavy frontal armor, but if it damaged tracks, vision devices, lighter vehicles, or exposed crews, it could still alter the fight. Mines did not need to be everywhere. They needed to be where movement depended on trust. The Germans understood numbers. They counted losses. They studied weapons. They adapted tactics. But the Soviet close-range ambush often worked in the spaces between categories. It was not simply anti-tank warfare, not simply infantry defense, not simply mine warfare, not simply partisan harassment. It was the combination that mattered. One mine stopped the vehicle. One machine gun pinned the infantry. One anti-tank weapon struck the exposed flank. One group of riflemen prevented recovery. One road became unusable. One delay reached the timetable. The effect moved outward. A battalion delayed on a road might fail to support another unit. Supplies might arrive late. Artillery might not be repositioned. Wounded might wait longer. A commander might choose a different route, only to lose more time. Even when casualties were not catastrophic, the rhythm of operations changed. And rhythm is not a small thing in war. Armies do not only fight with weapons. They fight with timing. The German army had built much of its success on arriving before the enemy was ready. Soviet ambushes answered by making arrival itself uncertain. Every bend, village, bridge, and forest road could take more time than planned. Every delay added weight to the next decision. There was also the mathematics of morale. How many times does a driver need to see a road explode before his hands tighten on the wheel at every suspicious patch of ground? How many villages must fire from cellars before infantry begin to hate doorways? How many anti-tank rifles must strike from close range before a tank commander feels exposed even inside armor? No staff table measures that cleanly, but it affects everything. The Soviets paid heavily for this kind of fighting. The ambush team was often close enough to be destroyed if the Germans recovered quickly. A hidden gun might be silenced after 2 shots. A sapper might never return. A machine gun crew might be buried under the house it fired from. The arithmetic was cruel on both sides. But from the Soviet perspective, the exchange could still make sense. A few men and a few weapons could force a larger German unit to slow, deploy, spend ammunition, call support, expose infantry, and lose confidence in the road ahead. This was not magic. It was a brutal economy. Small cost did not mean small sacrifice. It meant the men paying the cost were often asked to give everything in a place the map would barely remember. The Germans believed war was decided by the visible weight of formations. Tanks, guns, divisions, supply columns, air support. What really happened was that the Eastern Front repeatedly proved how a hidden handful of men could change the movement of much larger forces, if they chose the right seconds and the right meters. And that knowledge came with a human price no report could make tidy. The cost of waiting too close. The ambush is often described from the side that suffers it. The explosion, the confusion, the trapped column, the fear of hidden fire. But the men who carried out the ambush were not safe observers of German panic. They were inside the danger they created. A Soviet sapper who crawled toward a road at night knew that discovery might mean death before the battle even began. He might be shot by a patrol, caught by a flare, torn apart by his own charge if something went wrong, or left wounded between the lines where no one could reach him until morning. His work required patience, but not distance. He had to touch the ground the German vehicles would touch. He had to place violence with his hands. An anti-tank rifleman had to accept a similar bargain. His weapon made him visible the moment he used it. The muzzle blast, the sound, the movement of the barrel. All of it could betray him. If he missed, he might not get a second shot. If he hit, he might draw the full attention of the vehicle he had angered. The German response could be immediate and overwhelming. A grenade team had even less room for error. To throw effectively, they had to be close enough to see the target not as a shape but as a surface. The engine deck, the track, the hatch, the side of a vehicle, the open truck bed, the doorway where men were taking cover. Close enough to hear German voices. Close enough to smell exhaust. Close enough that running away afterward might be impossible. This is why Soviet close-range ambushes should not be romanticized. They were not clean acts of cleverness. They were acts of necessity carried out by men in terrible positions. Some were brave. Some were frightened. Most were both. The Soviet Union had suffered invasion on a scale that turned ordinary lives into military facts. Villages burned. Families vanished into occupation, evacuation, hunger, or graves. Men who had been factory workers, students, farmers, mechanics, clerks, and boys were placed in forests and ruins with orders to stop a machine built to keep moving. Their courage did not make them immune to fear. It made them act while afraid. German soldiers caught in these ambushes also paid in ways that should not be reduced to symbols. A burned vehicle did not contain an abstract enemy. Contained men. Some believed in the cause they served. Some had been shaped by propaganda. Some were hardened veterans. Some were young, cold, and terrified. When fire entered a vehicle, ideology did not protect flesh. When a road became a killing ground, the body did not care about the flag on the sleeve. A serious account has to hold both truths. The German army was an invading force serving a criminal regime in a war of annihilation in the East. And individual men still died individually. They burned, bled, froze, panicked, called for medics, and disappeared into reports that gave them numbers. Soviet soldiers, defending their land under a brutal system of their own, died in ditches, cellars, forests, and snowfields, often with no witness except the men beside them. Close-range combat stripped war of distance in every sense. It removed the comfortable separation between shooter and target. It forced men to see what they were doing. A rifleman firing at a shape across a field might never know the face. A grenade thrown into a vehicle at close range allowed fewer illusions. A German soldier clearing a cellar might find the Soviet gunner still alive beneath plaster dust. Both men too stunned for 1 second to move. That second is not usually in reports. Neither are the civilians. Villages used as ambush sites could become ruins in minutes. German retaliation could be savage. Soviet defensive positions drew artillery and fire onto homes already damaged by occupation and battle. Partisan activity in occupied areas often brought collective punishment. A road ambush might delay a military column and doom a nearby village in the same afternoon. War does not keep its costs in separate boxes. A successful ambush could save Soviet troops farther back, delay German movement, and destroy vehicles. It could also leave the men who carried it out dead, the village burned, and the survivors carrying memories no metal could lighten. This is why the story should not be told as a simple tale of clever underdogs humiliating a stronger army. That would be too easy. The truth is harder and more human. Soviet close-range ambushes worked because men accepted conditions where survival was uncertain. They waited while German vehicles came close enough to crush them. They fired knowing the reply might erase them. They used terrain because terrain was what they had. They used patience because ammunition, armor, and air support were not always there. The Germans feared these ambushes because they felt personal. The Soviets endured them because the war had become personal long before the Germans admitted what that meant. And by the time German commanders began to fully recognize the pattern, Soviet methods were no longer isolated acts of desperation. They were part of a learning army. The enemy was learning. The most dangerous enemy is not the one who surprises you once. It is the one who studies what happened afterward. The Red Army of 1941 was not the same force the Germans faced later in the war. It had suffered disasters on a scale almost impossible to absorb. Encirclements, lost armies, shattered command structures, abandoned equipment, millions killed, captured, or displaced. German confidence did not come from imagination alone. In the first months, German victories were real. But survival can become a school. The Soviets learned under fire. They learned at terrible cost. They learned what German armor needed, how German infantry moved, how artillery was called, how columns behaved under pressure, how quickly tanks became vulnerable without close infantry, how roads and bridges could decide operations larger than the men guarding them. They learned to layer danger. Mines did not stand alone. They worked with machine guns. Machine guns worked with anti-tank guns. Anti-tank rifles worked with terrain. Terrain worked with timing. Partisans worked with frontline operations. Scouts brought information. Sappers shaped the ground. Infantry waited in positions chosen not for comfort but for effect. By Stalingrad, Soviet closeness became famous in another form. Keeping positions near German lines reduced the usefulness of German artillery and air power. In ruins, the battle became a matter of rooms, stairwells, factories, cellars, and walls. The Germans still possessed firepower, but firepower became harder to apply cleanly. Every meter had to be taken from men who understood that distance favored the attacker. At Kursk, Soviet defensive preparation reached another scale. Mines, anti-tank guns, trenches, strongpoints, and layered defenses turned German advance into a grinding process. Not every fight was a close-range ambush in the narrow sense, but the principle remained. Deny clean maneuver, punish movement, force armor into prepared zones, and make every forward meter expensive. In forests and partisan areas, German units faced another version of the same problem. The enemy might not hold a line at all. He might strike rails, roads, supply vehicles, bridges, isolated detachments, and rear area troops. The front was no longer only where the maps said it was. That uncertainty forced German resources into security duties and made movement feel contested even away from major battles. German reports and lessons did adapt. They noted Soviet mines, close-range fire, concealed positions, anti-tank rifles, forest fighting, and stubborn infantry tactics. German soldiers were not blind to reality. They adjusted because they had to. But recognition is not the same as comfort. By the time a lesson is written down, men have already died teaching it. That is the delayed realization at the heart of this story. The Germans did not simply discover that Soviet soldiers were brave. They discovered that bravery had been organized into methods. Not always perfectly, not always efficiently, but often enough to alter the battlefield. The early belief had been that Soviet close combat showed backwardness. Men thrown forward because better methods were lacking. The reality was more complicated. Sometimes Soviet attacks were wasteful. Sometimes they were poorly coordinated. Sometimes men were spent brutally by their own command. But alongside that grim truth, another truth grew. Soviet small units, sappers, scouts, anti-tank teams, and infantry commanders developed a practical understanding of how to make German power misfire. They did not need to make German tanks weak. They needed to make German tanks uncertain. They did not need to defeat every formation. They needed to break formation at the point of contact. They did not need to control the entire battlefield. They needed to own the next 50 meters. That ownership could be brief. A minute, 10 seconds. The time between a vehicle entering a bend and the mine detonating beneath it. But in war, brief control at the decisive point can matter more than broad control everywhere else. German soldiers felt this even when reports softened it. They felt it in the way the front changed under their boots. The Soviet soldier was no longer only the man who charged or held. He was the man who waited, the man who let you pass, the man who fired from the flank, the man who had measured the road before you arrived. This was the enemy learning, and it forced the Germans to learn too. But there is a difference between learning a danger and escaping it. German units could become more careful, but caution slowed them. They could use more artillery, but artillery required ammunition and time. They could screen with infantry, but infantry became vulnerable. They could clear every house, but every house took minutes, and minutes became hours. The Soviet close-range ambush did not have to win the war alone. It only had to make the German way of war less certain. By the final years, German troops were often the ones defending, improvising, and fearing Soviet armor, artillery, and infantry moving westward. The battlefield had turned. But the memory of those earlier ambushes remained because they had revealed something fundamental before the larger reversal became obvious. The German army could be made afraid of the small spaces. A ditch, a cellar, a bend in the road, a tree line before dawn. And in those places, the distance between what they believed and what really happened could be measured in meters. The distance that disappeared. Returned to the road. The snow has settled again. Smoke drifts low between the trees. The engine that had been idling is silent now, or burning, or ticking softly as hot metal cools in the cold air. A track mark runs into the bend and stops where the blast changed its shape. Somewhere near the ditch, the thin wire lies slack. It no longer looks dangerous. That is how many weapons of war appear after they have done their work. Ordinary, small, almost insulting. A wire, a shovel, a broken wall, a ditch, a cellar window, a snowbank beside a road. Things too minor for grand strategy, too quiet for monuments, too easily lost in the language of reports. But men died because of them, and men survived because of them. The Germans believed, especially in the early years, that superior movement, coordination, armor, and command culture would keep the initiative in their hands. They believed that Soviet close-range resistance was often crude, desperate, and local. They believed reports could contain it. Ambush encountered, enemy resistance overcome, road cleared, advance resumed. But what really happened was harder to contain. Soviet close-range ambushes attacked the German sense of control. They did not always destroy large numbers of vehicles. They did not always decide major battles by themselves. They were not magic, and they were not without terrible cost. Yet they changed how German soldiers moved, how they looked at terrain, how they entered villages, how they approached forests, and how they understood silence. They made distance disappear. And when distance disappeared, war became something different. A tank was no longer only a machine of steel and firepower. It was a loud, blind, crowded place where men waited for impact. A road was no longer only a route. It was a question. A village was no longer only an objective. It was 100 possible firing points. A forest was no longer only cover. It was a presence. For the Soviet soldier, close-range ambush was often born from necessity. He did not always have enough guns, enough shells, enough food, enough sleep, enough time. What he had was ground, patience, anger, fear, orders, a few weapons, sometimes local knowledge, sometimes only the will to wait 5 seconds longer than instinct allowed. For the German soldier, the ambush was a lesson in vulnerability. It taught him that the enemy he had been told to underestimate could be disciplined in the most frightening way, silent until the chosen moment. It taught him that a report written after the fact could never fully explain the instant when the road exploded and every direction became dangerous. War is often remembered through large movements. Armies advancing, fronts collapsing, cities falling, generals deciding, maps changing color. But much of war is lived at a smaller scale. A man's thumb on a wire, a driver's foot on a brake, a rifleman holding his breath, a commander looking at a tree line and not liking the silence. These moments do not always change the map by themselves, but they change the men who must keep walking across it. The Germans feared Soviet close-range ambushes more than their reports admitted because reports could not admit everything. They could not fully admit the hesitation before the next road, the suspicion of the next village, the way a quiet forest could make trained soldiers feel watched, the way a few hidden men could make a powerful column suddenly aware of its own fragility. They believed fear belonged to the side being attacked. But what really happened was that, on the Eastern Front, fear often waited silently, close enough to hear the engines, close enough to smell the exhaust, close enough to let the first vehicle pass, and then close enough to make distance vanish. If you found this story worth remembering, leave a comment with where you are watching from. And if someone in your family served during the war, on any front, in any uniform, in any role, you are welcome to share their story below. Warfront Archive is built for the forgotten details, the overlooked soldiers, and the moments official reports could never fully explain. Subscribe to continue hearing the stories behind what they believed and what really happened.